Hello and welcome to another episode of TechHub.training solutions. Today we'll be going over the GenAI JE's challenge, which will use Python and generative AI to transform some dirty transaction data into some clean journal entries. Let's start with ChatGPT. You can go ahead and give it the data and it'll clean it for you. It's usually best to give it very specific instructions if possible, although it also does well if you give it if you ask it to brainstorm ways to clean it. So that's another way to go about it and say, I need to clean this data. Can you help me brainstorm ways to clean it? Give it specific instructions and then tell it where to begin. It'll do that. And then it'll go ahead and give you the code as well. So that's helpful if you want to use that in your own Jupyter notebook. And then it'll ask you what to do next. So we'll start by removing the null rows. And then from there, we'll remove duplicate transactions. And it's good to define things for ChatGPT as well. It usually knows, but it's good, especially if it could be construed as a different thing. So it's helpful to define things like right here where we say the duplicate transaction is where the values in the three columns are exactly the same for two or more rows. So it removes the duplicate transactions. The next part is what is really interesting. You ask it to impute values if a row is missing one or two values. So maybe it has amount, but it doesn't have date or memo, or maybe it has date and memo, but it doesn't have transaction, or any mix of those columns, or it has some and some of the others. And you're going to ask it to analyze the pattern of the other ones to try and impute values for it. So that's what's really helpful, because that's something you can't necessarily do with Python super well or super easily generally. Generative AI, however, can analyze that data for you and come out with a guess as to what that would be. In this case, we put in some data that it would be hopefully easily able to analyze bi-monthly rent transactions. So the memo is always going to be the same, and then there's just going to be one transaction on the 1st of every month and one transaction on the 15th of every month, and the amount will always be the same because it's bi-monthly rent. So it did catch that. It had a couple errors, but it kept trying until it fixed it, and then it successfully imputed those values. So the next thing you're going to want to do is get the new CSV file with those changes. So that's great. We went ahead and did that as well. In our example, we're actually going to go ahead and just read in the clean transaction CSV. And what you can do is take the CSV that ChatGPT gives you and compare it to the clean transaction CSV if you want. Just set up an easy Excel formula or something to check and see if they're the same. And if not, you can go back, or you can even ask ChatGPT to analyze if they're the same and say, here's the solution. How well did you do, right? Anyway, so you can go ahead and read in that. We'll sort by date and give it an index. The next thing we're going to want to do is read in the profits DF, and then we'll say, okay, great. We'll merge those on the memo in the profit percent, or sorry, on the memo. We'll do a left merge just because we want to keep all of the data from the data transactions, but we don't necessarily want to keep all the data from the profits data frame in case there's a client that maybe isn't in the transaction list for this month, for this year. So then we'll calculate the profit column. The reason why this is going to be helpful for journal entries is if you know what the profit is on a certain sale, and you know what the sales revenue amount is, then you can always calculate COGS, which is what you're going to need to be doing later. So we have that. That's great. We'll drop the profit percent and the date columns here, because we'll use those later. So what I did is I took the date and put it into a whole new DF. So just that column, but put it into a new data frame. And then we drop both the profit percent and the date columns. Perfect. And so here's our new data set. Looks great. We know what the profit is. We know if we set it up so that it would come up with a non-applicable value if it's a transaction that doesn't need a profit associated with it. So any kind of expense really isn't going to have a profit associated with it. So then we will create some journal entry columns. So we know that there's going to be a debit and a credit for each row, essentially, but there might be 2 debits and 2 credits if it's a sales transaction, because you'll need to record the revenue as well as the COGS and inventory, right? So what we'll do is we'll create the debit and the credit will always just be the amount, right, of the transaction, and the debit credit to the second one is always going to be the amount minus the profit. And that's, again, only going to be an issue if it's a sale. And what will happen is if it's not a sale, for debit amount 2 and credit amount 2, it'll come up with NA. So that'll work perfectly for us, right? The next thing we're going to want to do is take the type of the transaction, and we'll take the memo, and then we'll apply a lambda. So what that does is essentially if the first word right here, if the first word in X, X being the value in the memo column for each row, if the first word is sale, we'll say it's the type of transaction is sale. Otherwise, we're going to say X, and that'll come in more handy later, right? Because we'll say, okay, this is a sale. And the reason why we're doing that is because each memo for a sale says something like sale to Harris Inc. But for example, insurance payment is just going to say insurance payment. Rent is just going to say rent. So that's how we get around that. Specific sales to specific clients, we're just calling it sale, and then the type otherwise is just going to be exactly equal to memo. And that'll be more complicated in the real world, but it's a good way for you to start learning how to apply that to specific types of memos so that you can then classify it by type using this lambda, right? Great. So then the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to read in the example data. And we're going to take just the memo, debit 1, credit 1, debit 2, credit 2 columns from that. And the reason why is we just care about the not the amount of the debit, but the account that the debit is going to, if that makes sense. So is it going to sales? Is it going to cash? What is it going to, right? And then we'll say in the example data, we'll do the same thing. We'll apply that lambda to make it sale or whatever else it might be. And then what's great is we can then merge it on type and do a left merge, right? So that we then can put in the debit account and the credit account 1, the debit account and credit account 2, based on what the example entries are showing. So, and the reason why we're merging it on type, for example, if it's a sale, we know the debit 1 is sale, or debit 1 is cash, credit 1 will be sales revenue, debit 1 will be, debit 2 will be COGS and credit 2 will be inventory, right? And so those example transactions are basically just giving us a template to work with, and we're just applying that template using this code to our data frame so that we can see what all the journal entries. And now we have every single journal entry. It's not quite in order, right? But we have every single journal entry that we need. So wonderful. We will merge that back with our date data frame that we took out earlier. Perfect. We have that back. And then we're just going to take these columns that we need from it. So it's just going to be date, memo, the debit 1 amount, debit amount 1, credit amount 1, debit 2, debit amount 2, credit amount 2. And we just do that so then it's in the order that we kind of want it to be in, essentially. The next thing we're going to do, we're importing something called XLS Writer. And so we'll create a new workbook. We'll add a worksheet in that workbook. And then this is just a date format that'll come in handy down here much later. And then we'll use the row and column. They take arguments when you're writing into the workbook. It'll say worksheet.write, and it'll take a row argument and a column argument, and then whatever data you want and in whatever format you want, right? So we put a row and a column. We started at 0, so that'll just be the very first cell, right? A1. We'll do dffinal.index, right? And so now we have the row number essentially of every single thing that we want. So we're looping through. And the reason why we don't use iteros is it takes a lot of processing power. So index is usually better unless you absolutely need iteros. So we'll take that. We'll basically assign variables to every single column in each row. Yeah, we'll call this data. So that'll just be the row data for every row that you have. And then we'll just take the .loc, or sorry, not the .loc. We'll take the column of data, if that makes sense, because data will just be every single row. So for example, when it's iterating through the first row, it'll say, okay, the data is 2023-0101, sale to Harris Inc. And so you just call that data variable and then put in the column that you want, right? So we'll write that, and then we're just adding numbers to row and to column right before we write to the next thing, which will help us keep track kind of where we are. And you can add it outside of it or inside of it, whatever you'd like. So we do that and we put it in kind of a format that we want. What we do is we'll put the date, and then one column over, we'll just put the memo, right? So it'll say date memo, and then you go down a row, you'll write the debit account, you'll write the debit amount, you'll write the credit account, you'll write the credit amount, and then you'll do the same for the second journal entry if it's not a null, right? Because if it's null, we don't really want to write it into our Excel because it'll write it in not as just a blank cell, but it'll write it in as like NA or error. We don't want to see that in our Excel document when we're doing our journal entry, so we put an if statement in here. And then we'll just move down for the next entry because we're going to do it for every single row. And then once you're done with that, we'll close it. Here's kind of an example of what that is going to look like. Here are the journal entries. So looks great. As you can see, kind of shows the accounts here, and then it shows the amounts here, right? So yeah, that is the solution. Let us know if you have any questions, and good luck on TechHub.